Long before hope ever spoke her name, the universe placed her destiny in the dust at her feet, daring her to see value where the world saw nothing. And on that quiet morning, when the wind carried the scent of distant rain and unseen possibility, Amara felt life shift beneath her fingertips before she even understood why. It was the day a maid bent to pick trash, but rose holding the beginning of a future no one believed she could ever claim. The compound was already awake when Amara stepped into the morning light, though no one paid her the slightest attention. Cars glistened from the previous night's wash. The gardener swept fallen leaves with practiced indifference, and her employers moved through their routines with the comfortable rhythm of people who never worried about the weight of tomorrow. But Amara noticed everything, not the luxury that framed their lives, but the carelessness their comfort produced. The ground near the gate was scattered with torn plastic wrappers, crushed bottles, and pieces of packaging thrown away, without a second thought. She approached them not with disgust, but with a strange reverence, crouching down slowly, her fingers brushing the dirt as though she were searching for something deeper than trash. The world had always treated her as invisible, but in the quiet presence of waste, she felt oddly seen, as if each discarded item was whispering its own forgotten story. She gathered the pieces with deliberate care, studying their shapes, colors, textures. Years of hardship had given her a rare kind of perception, the ability to recognize potential even in broken things. When she held a crushed bottle to the light, she didn't just see plastic, she saw possibility, tiny but fierce, tucked into the very corners of rejection. The compound workers glanced at her briefly, shaking their heads as if she were strange for showing such interest in something so insignificant. Yet she did not flinch. Her eyes lingered on every crease, every label, every symbol imprinted on the material, sensing patterns she could not yet define. There was something rhythmic in the way certain plastics bent, something telling in the way others resisted pressure. She didn't fully understand what she was learning, but her instinct stored each detail carefully, as though preparing her for a future that would one day demand this knowledge. Her employers often walked past her without acknowledging her effort, treating her as part of the scenery, rather than a presence with her own inner world. But Amara had long made peace with being overlooked. Invisibility offered a unique freedom. The less they noticed her, the more she observed them, their consumption, their habits, their silent rituals of disposal. Every day she discovered patterns, which brand of bottled water they preferred, how often certain containers were thrown away, which plastics were used once and discarded without a second glance. Her mind, though untrained by formal education, worked with sharp clarity, weaving these observations together like threads forming a silent map. Behind the servants' quarters, she carved out a small corner for herself, a place no one cared enough to inspect. Over time, it transformed into a private sanctuary, where she kept the plastics she collected. She washed them, sorted them, arranged them by type and size, not yet knowing why this organization mattered, but trusting an instinct she couldn't silence. Sometimes she would run her hands across the growing pile, feeling a quiet warmth rise within her, a tenderness reserved for dreams too fragile to speak aloud. She feared the world would laugh if it ever discovered the hope she was nursing, so she held it close, tucked beneath her ribs like a tiny ember waiting for the right breath to grow. Her nights became her second life. After long hours of cleaning floors, polishing tables, and preparing meals, she borrowed a neighbor's phone for a few minutes at a time. She watched videos on recycling, processing plants, crushing lines, sorting systems, absorbing every image with the hunger of someone who understood that knowledge was the one treasure no one could take away from her. When she returned the phone, the glow stayed with her, illuminating corners of her mind she had never explored before. She lay awake long after the compound slept, imagining machines she had never touched, buildings she had never seen, and possibilities that seemed too bold to belong to someone in her position. Yet something inside her insisted that her life was not meant to remain confined within the walls of servitude. Something whispered that even forgotten things could be reborn, and maybe she could as well. But at dawn, as she approached the gate with her usual quiet focus, she froze. A strange bag of discarded materials lay waiting for her, unlike anything she had ever found, unnervingly deliberate, and carrying a weight that felt like a message. And in that breathless moment, she realized fate had placed a question at her feet, one she could no longer ignore. Long before anyone believed she was capable of greatness, the universe placed a simple torn bag in her path, a bundle of waste that glowed with opportunity only a desperate heart could recognize. It was the kind of discovery that whispered instead of shouted, a quiet spark waiting for the right soul to breathe it into flame. And as Amara opened that forgotten bag, she felt a shift in the air, as though destiny itself leaned closer, urging her to look deeper. The early morning sun had barely risen when Amara noticed the bag resting against the side of the gate, its edges frayed and its shape oddly weighed down as if reluctant to be ignored. She approached it cautiously, drawn not by curiosity alone, but by a sense that something inside called to her. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled it open, bracing herself for the familiar mix of dirt and disappointment. But her breath caught when she saw the contents: unused packaging materials, still clean, still crisp, untouched by decay or time. She lifted one piece, turning it toward the light, marveling at the way it shimmered like glass. Its value was subtle, hidden beneath the assumption that anything discarded must be worthless. Yet she knew instantly it was worth more than her weekly pay and carried far greater meaning than money alone. In that moment, a deeper understanding unfurled inside her. It was not the material itself that stunned her, but the realization that people threw away treasures every day without recognizing the quiet richness woven into each piece. She closed the bag gently, almost reverently, and tucked it beneath her arm as though cradling something fragile and rare. As she walked toward the servants' quarters, the weight of the bag felt symbolic, as if her hands carried not plastic, but a doorway to a new kind of life, one that stretched far beyond the invisible boundaries of servitude. Throughout the day, while she swept floors polished enough to reflect her silhouette, her thoughts drifted repeatedly to that bag. She found herself studying items her employers tossed without care, observing their textures, shapes, and the potential each held if given a second chance. It was as though she now saw the world through a different lens, one sharpened by emerging purpose. Even as she washed dishes, her mind wandered to images of sorting lines and crushing machines, imagining how the plastics she touched might be reborn into something strong, beautiful, and useful. She had never seen such machines in person, but the possibilities they represented painted vivid pictures in her mind. When evening arrived, she hurried to her small space behind the servants' quarters, her heart beating with a mix of excitement and fear. She laid out the items from the bag carefully, examining each piece with the instinctive precision of someone discovering a hidden map. She washed them, dried them, and grouped them by type, noticing patterns she had never recognized before. The process soothed her in a way nothing else ever had. It felt like creating order from chaos, giving purpose to what had been abandoned. With each item she cleaned, she felt her own spirit being cleansed of doubt, shaped into something steadier and more certain. Neighbors occasionally passed by and snickered, muttering comments about her collecting trash like a wayward child. Their ridicule cut deep, but she had learned long ago that the world mocked what it feared to understand. She kept her eyes lowered, her hands steady, refusing to let their voices drown out the quiet calling rising within her. Every evening, she borrowed a neighbor's phone for a few minutes, watching recycled materials travel through conveyor belts, transformed under blades she could almost feel. She studied the process with intense concentration, storing each detail in her mind like a secret library only she could access. The more she learned, the clearer her vision became, though she dared not speak it aloud. Dreams were dangerous things for a maid. They often ruined more than they repaired. But she felt something forming inside her, something that stretched wider than her circumstances, deeper than her fears. It was the beginning of a purpose that did not ask for permission to exist. It simply grew. Still, life had a way of testing the soil before allowing anything to take root. And the test arrived faster than she expected. The next morning, a single careless moment at work exposes her hidden interest in plastics, delivering a humiliation sharp enough to shake her, but powerful enough to push her toward a decision she can never undo. And as she stands frozen beneath her employer's scrutiny, she realizes the spark she carried is about to become a flame. The humiliation came like a slap she never saw coming, sharp, public, and heavy enough to silence the air around her. Yet beneath the sting, something ancient and unyielding rose within her, as if the very shame meant to break her had awakened a power too long buried. In that single moment, the woman the world dismissed as a maid began transforming into someone destiny could no longer ignore. The afternoon sun stretched across the compound with a lazy warmth when the insult unfolded, catching Amara unprepared. She had crouched near the back door, sorting the last of the plastic she planned to wash that evening. The items were arranged neatly beside her, each piece placed with careful intention, reflecting the quiet pride she took in her routine. But before she could gather them into her bucket, Madame emerged from the kitchen corridor, accompanied by two elegantly dressed guests. Their polished shoes clicked sharply against the tiles, each step punctuating their privileged conversations. They paused when they saw Amara on the ground, hands deep in the refuse they had never acknowledged as part of their lives. "What is this nonsense?" Madame's voice cut through the stillness, louder than necessary, and dripping with disdain. "You are touching filthy plastics again? In front of my visitors? Have you no shame?" She gestured dramatically toward the items, as though the sight of them were an offense to her status. The guests exchanged amused glances, their faces softening into expressions that carried far more judgment than words ever could. Amara froze, her cheeks burning as humiliation spread through her like wildfire. She wanted to explain, to defend herself, to reveal the dream she nurtured in silence, but her voice refused to rise. The moment swallowed her whole, reducing her to the quiet, invisible figure society insisted she remain. In that instant, it would have been easy to crumble, easy to abandon her strange collection, her secret watching of recycling videos, her whispered hopes, but instead, something hardened in her chest. A quiet defiance shaped not by anger, but by clarity. She realized that the humiliation did not define her. It merely revealed the limits of the world she served, and she felt, for the first time in her life, that these limits did not belong to her. She lowered her gaze, not in defeat, but in reflection, vowing silently that the next chapter of her life would be written on her own terms. That evening, after the compound settled into its usual lull, she slipped into the small corner behind the servants' quarters where she stored her collected plastics. She examined every item one last time, her fingers brushing the surfaces with a tenderness that surprised her. Then, with determination solidified by the day's events, she gathered everything into a large sack and made her way toward the street recycler who operated near the market. The walk felt heavier than usual, each step echoing the choice she had made, to no longer let her dream hide behind fear. When the recycler weighed her items and handed her the small stack of coins, Amara felt something shift deep within her. The money itself was modest, barely enough to buy a few basic necessities. Yet it held a meaning far larger than its value. For the first time, she recognized a truth that had lived quietly in the corners of her heart. Trash had given her what respect never did. It had given her purpose, clarity, and the spark of independence. She walked home with her shoulders slightly lifted, her spirit steadier than it had been in years. The next morning, Amara rose before dawn, long before the compound stirred. The sky was still wrapped in shades of soft blue and fading stars as she stepped out. The city smelled. She walked toward, watched her with suspicion, as if the mountains of waste belonged to them alone. Yet beneath the choking haze, something inside Amara steadied, whispering that this chaos was the doorway to the life she had begun to imagine. Amara's first steps into the city dump site felt like stepping into another universe, one ruled not by wealth or hierarchy, but by raw survival. The ground beneath her feet crackled with broken glass and twisted metal, releasing a crunching sound that echoed through the sprawling maze of waste. The air was thick with the scent of rot, smoke, and sun-baked plastic, a scent that clung stubbornly to her skin, even as she tried to breathe through the back of her throat. All around her, scavengers moved with fierce purpose, digging through mountains of refuse with the speed and precision of those who knew how to find value in seconds. She felt their eyes on her, assessing her presence, measuring her courage, deciding whether she belonged or needed to be pushed out. A group of seasoned scrap dealers stood along the far edge, their expressions hard and territorial. They watched her approach with a sharpness that sliced through the thick air. One of them stepped forward, his stance neither violent nor welcoming, but marked with a warning that carried the weight of long-held dominance. He told her the land was not meant for newcomers, especially not for a woman who looked too unsure, too clean, too hopeful. His tone made it clear that this was their territory, built through years of hardship and unwritten rules. Fear shot through her, gripping her chest with a sudden tightness, but she forced her breath to even out. She had not come to steal or threaten. She had come because her dream demanded courage, and courage demanded she stay. She thanked them quietly and nodded with the humility that came naturally to her, but she did not turn back. Instead, she moved slightly to the side, choosing a smaller heap of waste untouched by their hands. She crouched and began sorting through the piles, slowly at first, then with the growing rhythm she had practiced each night behind the servants' quarters. Her hands shook, not from disgust, but from the weight of being watched. Each movement felt like a statement, a declaration that she wasn't here to disturb, but to survive. The men exchanged surprised glances, but none stepped closer. Something in her quiet determination softened the tension, enough for them to simply observe without escalating their warning. As the sun rose higher, casting blistering heat across the site, an elderly scavenger approached her from behind, his steps unhurried, his eyes filled with something gentler than suspicion. His clothes bore the stains of decades spent in this world, yet his presence held the kind of quiet authority that could only be earned by endurance. He lowered himself beside her with a slow grace and began picking through the heap with hands that moved like a seasoned craftsman. After a few minutes of silence, he spoke softly, telling her that courage was rare in this place, especially the kind that did not try to prove strength through force or pride. He guided her away from the territories claimed by dangerous men and into smaller, safer corners of the dump site, where valuable plastics often hid beneath layers of less desirable waste. He showed her how to recognize the plastics buyers paid the most for, teaching her the subtle differences in texture, density, and color. He taught her how to read the markings stamped into the materials, identifying which would crush cleanly and which were too contaminated to be worth the effort. With each lesson, the world of waste transformed from chaos into a system she could understand. He also explained the hidden network of buyers scattered across the city, some honest, some manipulative, and warned her which routes to avoid if she wanted fair prices. His voice carried the wisdom of experience, shaped by years of walking these dangerous paths. Under his guidance, Amara's movements grew more confident. She learned how to work quickly without attracting unnecessary attention, how to sort with precision instead of desperation, and how to blend into the rhythm of the dump site without losing herself. Days turned into weeks, and each morning she found the elderly man waiting for her, a silent teacher shaping her into someone far stronger than she realized. She cherished his lessons, feeling a sense of belonging she had never found anywhere else. But one morning, as the haze of dawn settled over the waste piles, he was gone. His usual spot stood empty, the earth undisturbed, as though he had vanished into thin air. Cliffhanger. Yet in his absence, she found a small folded paper tucked beneath a piece of metal, covered in hand-drawn lines she did not yet understand. And the moment her fingers touched it, she sensed it carried the next turning point of her destiny. The old man's map did not look like treasure. Its lines were shaky, its folds worn thin, its paper stained with years of struggle. Yet the moment Amara unfolded it, the world seemed to shift, as though the ground beneath her feet recognized the weight of what she now held. It was a guide carved from decades of survival, pointing to roots richer than gold mines, if only she had the courage to follow them. Amara studied the map long after dawn had brightened the sky, her fingers tracing the crooked lines with a tenderness usually reserved for sacred texts. The old scavenger's handwriting trembled across the page, forming a delicate web of arrows, circles, and coded symbols, marking places only a seasoned survivor could understand. Each shape hinted at a story, each cluster of markings representing spots where waste accumulated in profitable layers, hidden pockets of opportunity scattered through the city's sprawling chaos. She realized he had not simply given her directions. He had entrusted her with the legacy of his life's work, a gift shaped by hardship and carried with pride. Her heart tightened with gratitude, mingled with the grief of his unexplained disappearance. She folded the map carefully and slipped it into her apron, feeling its presence against her skin like a heartbeat. The next days felt different, charged, purposeful, unfolding with the clarity of someone who finally held a compass in a world that once seemed directionless. Armed with the map, she ventured beyond the areas she once feared, discovering waste streams more valuable than she had ever imagined. Hotels discarded stacks of untouched plastic packaging. Schools generated piles of water bottles daily. Small factories produced leftover strips, caps, and containers that, though worthless to them, were precious in the hands of a recycler. But Amara quickly learned that one person could not cover the roots alone. The map demanded more than her two hands could give. It required a small army, a network. With careful thought and quiet determination, she approached a few street children she often saw roaming near the market, boys with bright eyes and swift feet who survived on odd jobs and scraps. She spoke gently, offering them small pay in exchange for bottles, wrappers, and containers gathered from specific points on the map. They listened with curiosity, sensing sincerity in her voice. When they agreed, her world expanded in ways she hadn't dared to hope. In no time, her little team returned with bags of waste that filled her backyard corner faster than she could have managed alone. She taught them how to pick clean items and where to search without getting into trouble, creating a rhythm that uplifted both their lives and hers. The more they gathered, the more she sorted. The more she sorted, the more efficient her washing became. And with each cycle, her understanding deepened, of plastics, of value, of the quiet power of consistent effort. Her backyard transformed into a small sorting hub, a humble but thriving space that buzzed with new purpose. She arranged bottles by color, set aside high-density plastics separately, and experimented with drying methods that preserved quality. At night, while other servants slept, she washed plastics by lantern light, her movements steady and precise. Some evenings she paused, allowing the silence to wrap around her like a blanket, marveling at how waste, something she once picked timidly, had become the anchor of her courage. She lived a double life now, maid by day, budding entrepreneur by night. The contrast between the two identities was stark. During the day, she scrubbed floors and polished surfaces, blending into the background of a world that never asked for her dreams. But by night, She worked with the posture of someone who knew her hands were building something larger than her circumstances. She could feel her spirit stretching, strengthening, maturing with every bag of plastic she washed. Her earnings doubled, then tripled. For the first time, she felt what quiet triumph tasted like. Not loud, not celebrated, but steady, deep, and alive in her chest like a growing flame. She used part of her income to buy sturdier gloves, a better washing basin, and a small tarp to protect her materials from rain. Each purchase felt like a step toward a future she had once feared to imagine. But one night, as she rinsed a pile of bottles beneath the faint glow of the servant quarters light, the wind shifted. A thick smoke drifted through the air, carrying a scent that made her chest tighten. She turned toward the main house, noticing an orange flicker reflecting against the windows. Something was wrong. Within moments, the compound erupted with chaos. The main house consumed by rising flames that illuminated every hidden corner of her backyard. And as voices shouted and alarms rang, she realized the world she had kept secret for so long was about to be exposed. The night the smoke curled into the sky, Amara felt her heart rise with it. Terrified that the flames would not only swallow the house, but expose the secret life she had built in the shadows. What she feared most was not losing her job, but losing the fragile dream she had guarded like a wounded bird. And as the fire roared louder, fate stepped forward, ready to reveal what she had hidden for so long. Everything changed in a moment. A shout from the corridor, a scent of burning fabric drifting through the air, and the distant crackle of flames rising like a warning from the heavens. Amara dropped the basin she was rinsing and raced toward the main house, her heart pounding with confusion and fear. She had known that old electrical wires hissed on humid nights, but she never imagined they would betray the household at such an hour. Servants ran in frantic circles, voices overlapping in a frantic storm of instructions, while thick smoke poured from a window near the sitting room. Shadows flickered violently inside, the fire dancing with reckless hunger. Amara covered her mouth with her scarf, coughing as she helped pull furniture away from the spreading flames. Even in the panic, her eyes darted toward the backyard, where her carefully sorted plastics, hidden for months, sat exposed beneath the trembling lantern light. She prayed the darkness would conceal them, but fate did not answer. As the fire brigade arrived and water blasted through the smoky air in heavy arcs, the master of the house strode into the backyard, scouting for the source of the fire and checking if any danger had spread behind the servants' quarters. His flashlight swept across the earth, cutting through the haze. It landed on Amara's neatly stacked bundles, washed plastics tied in loops of woven twine, rows of sorted materials glistening with the faint moisture of evening air. The light lingered longer than she hoped. She froze as though the beam had pinned her in place, her breath trapped somewhere between dread and resignation. When he turned to her, his voice held more curiosity than anger, but the weight of the moment felt suffocating. She stepped forward slowly, hands trembling, her spirit quivering as though balancing on the thin edge between truth and ruin. With the fire fading behind them and smoke drifting like fragile ghosts above their heads, she confessed everything. How she collected waste in secret, how she washed it each night, how a dream had taken root despite the smallness of her life. Her voice wavered as she described the recycling videos she had watched on borrowed phones, the map given to her by the old scavenger, the children she hired to collect along hidden routes. She expected condemnation, mockery, or dismissal. Instead, she found silence. The master of the house watched her with a stillness she did not recognize. His expression softened slowly, not in pity, but in a kind of admiration that unsettled her even more. Something in her confession seemed to awaken a memory in him, or perhaps a longing he had buried beneath years of privilege. He asked her questions, not as an employer demanding explanations, but as a man intrigued by the clarity of her vision. When she finished speaking, breathless and uncertain, He stood upright and nodded, the gesture simple but striking enough to make her feel the earth shift beneath her feet. The next morning, once the household had settled and the burned section of the sitting room was closed off for repair, he called Amara aside. She walked to him cautiously, expecting reprimand or dismissal. Instead, he surprised her with words she had never dreamed of hearing. He told her she had courage, ambition, and a clarity of mind, rare even among those with wealth. He offered her something unimaginable, half-day leave, every day, to pursue her recycling project without hiding. It felt like the sky had widened above her, stretching into possibilities she once thought were reserved for other people. Before she could gather her thoughts, he handed her a slip of paper bearing the name of a microfinance officer he trusted, someone who supported small enterprises led by hard-working individuals. Her hands trembled as she thanked him. She tucked the paper close to her chest, feeling the warmth of its promise. The next afternoon, she visited the microfinance office. The officer, a woman with sharp eyes and a presence forged by years of shaping entrepreneurs, listened as Amara shared her idea. She asked deep questions, testing the strength of Amara's understanding, exploring the edges of her vision. Amara answered with honesty, humility, and passion, her voice steady despite the storm of nerves inside her. For the first time, someone with power saw her not as a maid, but as a mind worthy of investment. Then the officer leaned back, tapping her pen thoughtfully, and said the words that made Amara's heart stumble. Amara must submit a formal business plan, structured, detailed, and professional. But she has never written one in her life. And as the officer's deadline echoes in her mind, she realizes this demand may either unlock her future or stop her dream before it ever begins. She had never written a business plan, never stepped into a classroom where such dreams were shaped, yet the fire inside her refused to dim. With nothing but courage to lean on, she faced a blank page that frightened even educated minds. And as she began to write, her words rose not from schooling, but from the raw determination that life had carved into her. When Amara first sat before the borrowed notebook given to her by a kind market librarian, her hands trembled with a fear that threatened to undo all the progress she had made. The page stared back at her, with an unnerving emptiness, a whiteness that seemed to whisper of worlds she had never been invited to explore. She held the pen for a long moment, remembering all the times she had scrubbed floors silently, while others discussed business strategies she never understood, recalling how school had slipped from her grasp as a child when survival became more urgent than education. Yet now, with a dream too alive to silence, she lowered the pen to the paper, telling herself that beginnings were meant to be imperfect. She wrote her name first, slowly, carefully, shaping each letter as though it held the weight of her future. The library became her sanctuary. After her morning chores, she walked there with quiet purpose, her heart beating with the rhythm of someone learning to trust possibility. She searched through shelves with titles she struggled to read, borrowing business books filled with terms she did not yet comprehend. Each evening, she returned to her small shed behind the servants' quarters, spreading notes across the floor, whispering foreign words until they felt familiar. Revenue, projection, supply chain, asset value. She scribbled definitions, crossed them out, rewrote them, and asked strangers at the library for help, swallowing her pride every time she approached someone with a question. Some turned away impatiently, but others, drawn by the sincerity in her eyes, explained concepts gently, sketching diagrams that made her world widen just a little more. Little by little, her proposal began to take shape. She modeled it after the templates she studied, though her version carried none of the polished language of professionals. Instead, her plan breathed with honesty. She described the routes she discovered through the old scavenger's map, the children she hired ethically, the washing system she perfected through trial and error, and the quiet demand growing among local buyers for sorted plastics. Her numbers were simple, but they were real. tested through sweat-filled nights and sunrise labor. Every line she wrote carried the echo of a woman who had worked for dignity long before she worked for profit. Weeks later, with the notebook filled and her final paragraph written in a hand steadier than when she began, Amara walked back to the microfinance office. The officer leafed through the proposal slowly, pausing at certain sections, her brow furrowing in thought. Amara stood tall, despite the tremble in her spirit, clasping her hands together to anchor herself as the room's silence deepened. She expected criticism, perhaps even dismissal, prepared to defend every page she had poured her soul into. But when the officer finally closed the notebook, her expression softened with a hint of admiration. She told Amara that what she lacked in complex terminology, she made up for in clarity, ambition, and authenticity. The proposal was unconventional, yet it carried something stronger than perfect grammar. It carried vision. The loan approval came in the form of a handshake and a stamped document she held as though it were a fragile relic of hope. With the funds, she purchased a hand-powered crusher, a machine small enough to fit inside her rented shed, but powerful enough to reshape plastic into uniform pieces. She chose a modest shed near a quiet corner of the market, its tin roof glinting beneath the sun like a symbol of her rising path. Each morning before sunrise, she unlocked the shed and worked with disciplined focus, feeding bottles into the crusher, turning waste into uniform pellets she wrapped in sacks. Sweat ran down her arms, dust clung to her clothes, and yet she felt a quiet triumph building inside her, one that pulsed with every cycle of the machine. But triumph, she soon learned, has its own tests. When her first full batch was ready, she delivered it to a reputable buyer, expecting to hear encouragement. Instead, the man emptied the bag onto a table and frowned. The pieces were inconsistent in size. Some still held traces of moisture, and a few fragments carried faint discoloration from improper sorting. Amara's heart tightened as she listened, not to cruelty, but to disappointment she feared she could not recover from. Cliffhanger. The buyer's final verdict strikes her like a cold wind. Her entire batch has failed quality inspection, and as she stands in that warehouse, staring at the pellets she worked so hard to produce, she realizes one misstep may cost her the chance she fought so desperately to earn. The moment the buyer swept her crushed plastics off the table with a frown, it felt as though the ground beneath her dreams shifted. She had climbed too far, fought too hard, hoped too deeply to hear the word failure, but it crashed over her with a force she could not escape. And in that instant, she wondered if destiny had only opened its doors to shut them again. The warehouse smelled of metal, dust, and old chemicals, an atmosphere that made Amara's heart race as she set down her bag of crushed plastic pellets. She had carried them with pride, imagining her buyer's approving nod, imagining the beginning of something she could finally call her own. For nights, she had worked under dim lantern light, grinding, washing, drying, repeating each step until her fingers wrinkled and her muscles ached. She believed she had done everything right, but as the buyer emptied her materials onto the inspection table, his expression shifted from indifference to irritation. He pointed out the inconsistencies, lifting pieces that were too large, too damp, uneven in color, tainted by the faintest impurities she thought she had rinsed away. His words did not carry cruelty, but they carried truth, and truth landed heavier than any insult. She nodded silently, swallowing the sharp sting rising in her chest. She tried to gather the recovered pieces, but her hands shook, betraying the dignity she tried so hard to preserve. When she left the warehouse, the afternoon sun felt too bright, too harsh, reflecting a world that continued as though her small failure meant nothing. She walked home slowly, each step heavy with disappointment. She replayed the entire process in her mind, recognizing where haste had replaced patience, where exhaustion had clouded her judgment, where her lack of proper tools had forced shortcuts she could no longer afford. By the time she reached the small shed, the weight of the rejection settled fully inside her. A quiet ache that threatened to fracture her conviction. But beneath the ache, something steadier stirred, something that refused to let a single failure define her. She spread the buyer's notes across the shed floor, studying each mistake with the precision of someone who understood that growth often rose from humiliation. She listed the impurities she needed to eliminate and the consistency she needed to master. The work ahead frightened her, but it also sharpened her focus. She realized she could not rise alone. She needed help, people who cared as deeply as she did. That night, she visited the nearby women's market, where she had once sold vegetables for her mother. She gathered a small group of women she trusted, widows, single mothers, and elderly aunties who worked tirelessly, yet earned too little to survive. She explained her recycling project with a mixture of humility and determination, offering small wages for consistent sorting and washing. They studied her carefully, sensing the sincerity behind her voice, and agreed. Soon, her shed echoed with the sounds of collaboration. The swish of rinsing water, the scrape of drying mats, the gentle rhythm of hands working with purpose. With the support of her new team, Amara developed a workflow smoother than anything she had managed alone. The women introduced techniques she had never considered, sun-drying methods passed down through generations, natural scrubbing mixtures that removed stains without chemicals, sorting rituals that added speed without sacrificing accuracy. Their combined wisdom transformed her facility from a lonely shed into a small but mighty engine of improvement. When the next batch of plastic pellets was ready, she held them in her palms, feeling their uniformity, the dryness achieved through the women's. Careful drying lines, the clarity achieved through patient rinsing. She approached the same warehouse with a steadier heartbeat and set the bag before the buyer once more. This time, as he inspected the pellets, his expression softened. He nodded slowly, acknowledging the difference with a quiet respect she had not expected. For the first time, he called her work clean, consistent, market-ready. She walked home with the small payment in her bag and a trembling sense of pride in her spirit. The women celebrated with her that evening, laughing beneath the fading sun, their voices rising with the joy of shared victory. Amara felt stronger than she had since the day she first dreamed of building something meaningful. Failure had not broken her. It had carved her into someone more capable, more precise, more resilient than the girl who once picked trash in silence. But triumph, she knew, rarely arrived without shadows. Unbeknownst to her, a corrupt middleman in the recycling chain had been watching her rise with growing irritation, and his plans for sabotage were already quietly unfolding. And as Amara prepared for her next delivery, she remained unaware of the danger quietly inching toward everything she had built. The morning her supply chain collapsed felt like watching a woven basket unravel thread by thread, each break exposing how fragile success could be. She had believed effort alone would protect her, but the sudden silence of her roots taught her a bitter truth. Rise too quickly, and shadows begin to whisper your name. And as she stood in the empty lot, waiting for trucks that never came, she realized that success did not scare her, but the enemies it awakened did. Amara woke before dawn, as she often did, expecting to hear the faint rattle of carts rolling toward her shed, and the chatter of familiar faces bringing sorted waste. Instead, she stepped into a silence so unnatural, it made her pause. The morning breeze carried no scent of newly gathered plastics, no murmur of footsteps on the dusty ground. Even the street children who usually arrived first were nowhere in sight. She walked the length of the route she had marked in her mind, her sandals pressing into the damp earth as she searched for the usual signs of movement. But every corner felt deserted, every path strangely barren. It was as though the heartbeat of her operation had stopped overnight. Confused, she visited the markets, hotels, and gathering spots where she normally intercepted small collectors. Instead of greetings, she met uneasy glances and hurried gestures. One of the drivers, older and known for his honesty, finally pulled her aside. He explained in a hushed voice that a middleman, an established figure in the informal recycling network, had bribed several drivers to block her access to raw materials. Her expansion, her growing influence, her rising efficiency had threatened the chain he controlled. Instead of competing honorably, he had cut off her supply at its source. The revelation struck her like a cold wind, not because it surprised her. Success always disturbed those who thrived on monopoly, but because it came at a moment when she had just begun to trust her momentum. She walked back to her shed slowly, the weight of sabotage pressing against her ribs. Yet beneath the disappointment, another force stirred, a quiet defiance shaped by years of survival. If one door had been slammed shut, she would build another. That very afternoon, she drafted a handwritten letter and visited every hotel, school, restaurant, and small business within reachable distance. She introduced herself not as a victim of sabotage, but as the owner of a rising recycling micro-facility, offering free daily waste pickup. She spoke with clarity, humility, and a determination that tightened her voice with sincerity. Managers who had once ignored her now listened attentively, intrigued by her professionalism and the environmental value she offered. Some even invited her to inspect their waste areas, impressed by her willingness to build honest partnerships. Within days, her network rebloomed, this time stronger, more stable, rooted in direct connections instead of fragile middlemen. The street children resumed collecting, guided by Amara's expanded system. The women in her team adapted with remarkable grace, adjusting their cleaning routines to accommodate the new influx of materials. Slowly, the rhythm of her operation returned, steadier than before, anchored not in chance, but in strategy. As weeks passed, her improved supply attracted growing attention in small markets. Buyers who once doubted her now admired the consistency of her materials, and word spread of her reliability. One afternoon, a representative from a major exporter visited her shed after hearing of her rising reputation. He inspected her sorted bales carefully, appreciating the clarity, uniformity, and dryness of her pellets. His questions were detailed, sharp, and strategic, but she answered with a calm born from experience and unyielding discipline. Before he left, he offered her a formal supply agreement, small at first, yet powerful enough to elevate her operations beyond the limits of local markets. That night, Amara sat outside the shed, staring at the moonlight settling gently across the compound. She felt a quiet victory settling into her bones, not loud, not triumphant, but deep and grounding. She had risen through sabotage, not by confronting it, but by outgrowing it. She whispered a soft prayer of gratitude, knowing each step she took demanded equal measures of resilience and grace. But as dawn approached and she prepared to meet her team for their largest batch yet, a pair of unfamiliar vehicles rolled toward her shed. The tires crushed the gravel with a deliberate slowness that made her straighten instinctively. Men in official uniforms stepped out, their expressions unreadable, clipboards tucked beneath their arms. Government inspectors had come, unannounced, stern, and carrying forms she had never seen. And as they approached her facility with measured steps, she felt destiny shift again, uncertain whether it had come to lift her higher or pull the ground out from beneath her. When the officials stepped out of their vehicles, she braced herself for the kind of punishment that crushed small dreams before they ever began. But as their badges glimmered beneath the morning sun, she sensed that fate had arrived in an unexpected uniform, watching her with eyes that searched deeper than her fear. And in that breathless moment, she realized that not every disruption is meant to break a person. Some arrive to rewrite destinies. The inspectors entered her facility with a formality that made even the walls seem to stiffen. Clipboards in hand, they examined every corner of her processing shed, as though searching for flaws too small for untrained eyes. Amara followed at a respectful distance, her hands clasped to steady the quiet tremor in her bones. She had prepared herself for worst-case scenarios, fines she could never pay, accusations she could not contest, or shut down orders that would crush the livelihood of the women and children who depended on her. Yet beneath her anxiety, she carried a fragile confidence born from countless nights spent refining her process, and from the countless hours her team invested in making the shed not just functional, but honorable. One inspector knelt beside the crusher, running his fingers along its base and nodding at the absence of debris. Another examined the drying racks, lifting pieces of plastic with the precision of someone accustomed to catching hidden mistakes. They sniffed the water filtration drums, tested the clarity of her pellets, and inspected the logs she kept of every collection route. Amara's heart raced as they whispered among themselves, pointing to certain details she could not hear. She struggled to read their expressions, neutral, unreadable, steady in a way that both unnerved and intrigued her. Minutes stretched into what felt like an hour, the air thick with unspoken judgment. Then something shifted. The inspector leading the team closed his clipboard gently and looked at her not with suspicion, but with something dangerously close to admiration. He asked how long she had been operating, and when she admitted it had been only a short while, his brow lifted in genuine surprise. They asked about her training, and she explained how she learned through borrowed templates, videos on neighbors' phones, and long nights of experimentation. Instead of criticism, they exchanged thoughtful glances, as though suddenly recognizing the rare blend of intelligence and determination standing before them. After a final round of questioning, the lead inspector pulled out a sealed envelope, its crisp edges contrasting the rough earth beneath their feet. He explained that the government had launched a national recycling initiative aimed at strengthening community-level waste processing, but few individuals demonstrated the discipline or structure necessary to lead such operations. Her facility, though small, displayed efficiency, cleanliness, and organization far exceeding what they found in other informal setups. Her record-keeping impressed them, her teamwork model intrigued them, and her unwavering commitment stirred something deeper, a proof that brilliance did not always come wrapped in certificates. They invited her to join the national program. Amara stood frozen as their words sank into her spirit, each one carving through the disbelief she carried like a shield. They promised her access to advanced training workshops, professional mentorship, and refurbished machinery that would amplify her capacity beyond the limitations of hand-powered tools. She felt her breath waver, not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that the world she once watched from a distance was finally opening its doors to her. When the new machinery arrived weeks later, gleaming, heavy, humming with potential, her entire team gathered around it with reverence. The processing center expanded, its walls rebuilt and extended, its floors reinforced, its workflow redesigned to accommodate growing demand. Dozens of women found work under her leadership, each bringing unique skills, each contributing to a system that balanced precision and community. Children who once roamed the streets aimlessly now earned honest income through scheduled collection routes. The shed transformed into a mid-scale processing center, its daily rhythm echoing with purpose rather than desperation. As her success rippled across the region, journalists arrived with cameras and notebooks, eager to capture her journey, from maid collecting leftovers in secret to a rising figure in the recycling world. Interviews broadcast her story across screens, radios, and online platforms, inspiring thousands who saw themselves in her struggles and victories. Amara felt humbled by the attention, yet grounded by the memory of her first failures, her first fears, her first hesitant steps toward change. She never let triumph overshadow the humility that built her foundation. But destiny rarely unfolds without testing its chosen vessels. When a devastating national flood exposed the country's overwhelming waste crisis, leaders turned to her, not as a participant, but as a voice needed at the front. And as urgent calls poured in, Amara realized the next chapter would demand a kind of courage she had never been asked to carry before. When the floodwaters rose, swallowing streets and homes with a force no one expected, the nation searched desperately for answers. Beneath the panic and destruction, one truth became undeniable. The crisis was born from waste, mismanagement, and years of neglect. And in that single moment, as the country gasped for solutions, every path pointed to the woman who once sorted trash behind her employer's house. The rains arrived earlier than anyone predicted, heavy and relentless, drumming against rooftops with the fury of a sky long burdened by human carelessness. At first, the streets simply shimmered with water, puddles forming in harmless circles. But within hours, the drains clotted with plastic waste, bottles, sachets, wrappers, objects once ignored, now rising like a dark army blocking every channel meant to protect the cities. Water spilled over sidewalks, rushed into markets, swallowed homes, and swept through neighborhoods that had never known flooding before. Panic erupted as families climbed onto rooftops, watching belongings drift away, like fragments of a broken world. News channels broadcast the disaster in trembling voices, showing streets transformed into murky rivers carrying mountains of plastic that refused to sink. Engineers argued, politicians blamed one another, and environmental experts shouted warnings they had repeated for years. But solutions felt distant, too slow, too complicated, too embedded in bureaucracy to respond to a crisis unfolding by the minute. Then one official mentioned her name, followed by another, and another, until a consensus formed around the one person who had proven capable of turning chaos into structure. Amara's phone rang just after dawn. She had spent the night comforting her workers, many of whom lost parts of their homes to the rising waters. When she heard the official request, urgent, immediate, national, her breath stalled. They were summoning her to the capital, not as a guest, not as a consultant, but as a necessary force in designing an emergency recycling system that could prevent the disaster from worsening. She packed a small bag, wiped the exhaustion from her eyes, and boarded a government vehicle that sped through rain-soaked roads toward the heart of the crisis. Upon arrival, she entered a room filled with ministers, environmental scientists, logistics experts, and military planners. Large screens displayed maps of blocked waterways, waste hotspots, and vulnerable neighborhoods still at risk. For a moment, Amara felt the weight of her past pressing against her ribs. Memories of being a maid, of scrubbing floors silently, of being overlooked in rooms far less intimidating than this. But as the officials described the paralysis in the waste system and the need for immediate intervention, something inside her solidified. She stepped forward with a calm steadiness only hardship could teach. She outlined a plan not born from theory, but from lived experience. She explained how waste moved through the cities, how informal collectors worked, how processors relied on timing, access, and consistency. She described a national network connecting urban waste producers to regional processors, bypassing the corrupt chains that had weakened the system. She recommended tools that communities could use immediately and temporary routes that would keep plastic from suffocating the waterways. Her CEO voice carried a quiet authority that hushed the room, not because it demanded power, but because it revealed understanding deeper than any technical report. Within days, her plan became the backbone of the emergency response. Volunteers cleared drains using her mapped priorities. Factories redirected their waste streams following her schedules, and small processors collaborated for the first time across regional lines. The floods receded slowly, painfully, leaving destruction behind, but also revealing a new respect for the woman who had transformed insight into action. Her company expanded rapidly as the government formalized the network she designed. Collection centers opened in every major region, staffed by teams she trained personally. Refurbished machinery from the national initiative powered her facilities, allowing her to process plastics at a scale that once seemed impossible. News stations aired her story daily, portraying her journey from maid to national reformer as a symbol of what diligence and imagination could accomplish. People across the country began seeing waste not as a nuisance, but as a resource, because she had shown them its value. But amidst the interviews, policy meetings, and public recognition, a truth lived quietly in her heart. A truth she had carried since the day she collected her first plastic bottle behind her employer's house. And as she prepared for the largest environmental summit in the nation's history, she knew she could no longer hold it in. Standing before leaders, cameras, and thousands watching from home, she opened her mouth, not to boast, but to reveal a truth she had hidden for years. And the moment her first words left her lips, the entire hall leaned forward, sensing that what she was about to confess could shake the very foundation of her legacy. When she stepped onto the summit stage, the room fell into a silence thick enough to feel on the skin, as though every breath waited for her next. Cameras glimmered like restless stars, leaders leaned forward with expectation, and yet her eyes held something far different from triumph. They held the weight of a truth she had carried alone for years. And as her voice trembled through the first words, the nation realized she was not about to boast. She was about to unveil the secret behind her empire. Amara stood beneath the bright conference lights, aware that the story the world celebrated was only half the truth. For months now, newspapers had named her a miracle of innovation, calling her empire a testament to brilliance, ingenuity, and forward thinking. Yet deep inside, she knew that her journey had not begun with brilliance, but with hunger, the kind that carved its lesson into a person's bones long before their hands learned the language of opportunity. She inhaled slowly, feeling the weight of her past pressing against the back of her throat. Then she lifted her chin, letting her gaze sweep across the hall filled with ministers, scholars, environmental leaders, and thousands watching through screens across the continent. Her voice wavered at first, but steadied with the courage of someone who finally understood that truth carried a power greater than any award. She told them she had not entered the recycling world with ambition or strategy. She had begun collecting trash because she had nothing. No education, no financial safety, no door that opened to the life others took for granted. She described standing behind her employer's house, lifting bottles and wrappers from the dirt with hands that trembled from exhaustion, not because she dreamed of empire, but because she needed to survive. She spoke of shame, of fear, of being dismissed and ridiculed, yet clinging to each discarded item as though it carried a whisper of possibility. The hall softened around her as she spoke, the murmurs fading into an almost reverent stillness. Her confession did more than reveal her beginning. It humanized the thousands of informal waste workers across the country who lived in the same shadows she once did. She told the nation that she did not rise because she was exceptional, but because she refused to abandon the dignity buried beneath society's discarded things. She talked about the women who washed plastics with her, the children who ran through the streets collecting bottles, the old scavenger whose map carved her path. She reminded the audience that the foundation of her empire was built not on large machines or financial capital, but on humility, community, and the labor of hands often overlooked by policy and progress. Her truth rippled outward like a stone dropped into deep water. Conversations erupted across social platforms and communities as people began to question how many other innovators the country had discarded without noticing. Activists praised her courage. Policymakers reconsidered their assumptions. Environmental leaders emphasized that her confession might be the turning point the nation needed. A reminder that sustainability depended not only on technology, but on respecting those who interacted with waste long before the world realized its value. In the days that followed, her empire transformed from a business success story into a symbol of African innovation rooted in human dignity. Young entrepreneurs visited her centers seeking mentorship, inspired by her honesty. Universities invited her to speak. Governments across the region studied her methods. International leaders asked her to consult on waste management policies. Yet despite the attention, Amara remained grounded, anchored by the memory of the ground where she first bent to pick trash. She knew that no matter how high she climbed, she could not forget the soil that shaped her. Weeks later, after a whirlwind of interviews and planning sessions, she returned quietly to the dump site where everything had begun. The air smelled of earth, smoke, and memory. The ground felt familiar beneath her feet. The same uneven soil she had once feared. The same rough terrain that had hidden the seeds of her destiny. She walked slowly, letting the echoes of her past guide her steps. For a long moment, she stood still, whispering gratitude into the open air, thanking the land that had shaped her, the lessons that had broken and rebuilt her, and the destiny that had risen from scraps no one else wanted. Just as she turned to leave, footsteps approached softly behind her. She turned to see a little girl, no older than 8, standing with a shy determination and holding a small bag of bottles against her chest. The girl looked at Amara with bright, steady eyes, as though recognizing a path she longed to follow. And in that quiet exchange, Amara sensed the beginning of another story, one that might rise even higher than her own. If this story touched your heart, don't leave silently. Share your thoughts in the comments so others can feel the journey with you. Subscribe to join a community where every story carries a lesson, a heartbeat, and a spark of hope. Like the video if Amara's courage inspired you, and share it to remind someone that greatness can rise from anywhere. Your support keeps these powerful stories alive, and the next chapter begins with you.